Welcome to the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations 65th Anniversary Gala, celebrating 65 years of leadership from 1946 to 2011. The origins of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations can be traced directly back to the First Nations leaders who negotiated treaty with the Crown throughout the late 1800s and the early part of the 20th century. Shortly after treaty, it became apparent to the First Nations that treaties were not being honored and would not be implemented without action on their part. Treaties represented both a political agreement between the parties as well as a spiritual undertaking that had to be honored. Although First Nations had organized politically, economically, and socially for centuries to enrich and protect their way of life, new lobby efforts across the country triggered new alliances and political organizations. The League of Indians of Canada was established in the East in 1919, and by 1922, a western branch took hold. The first president was Edward Hennequin, who was succeeded by John B. Tatusis. Throughout the early part of the 1900s, First Nations in different areas of the prairies continued gathering to discuss common concerns and ways to advance their interests. Several organizations emerged during this era, including the Protective Association for Indians and Their Treaties, led by John Gambler of the Muscopheating First Nation, the Association of Saskatchewan Indians, led by Joe Drever of the Mistawasses First Nation, and the Queen Victoria Treaty Protective Association, led by William Joseph of Big River First Nation. In 1946, three organizations in Saskatchewan met, agreed to unite, and established a single First Nation organization in the province, the Union of Saskatchewan Indians. John B. Tatusis, who had been the leader of the League of Indians, was elected president, and John Gambler, who was from the Protective Association, was elected vice president. The mandates of the various organizations included protection of treaty rights, Indian lands and resources, as well as working for better education and living conditions on reserves. Together, under the new organization, delegates agreed on common objectives, values, and a mandate that included treaty protection, advancing economic, educational, and social conditions, cooperation with others, democracy, respect and tolerance, and constructive criticism. These values and this mandate remain the foundation of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations today. In 1958, the organization became the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians, a name that held until the 1980s. The FSI continued working towards fulfilling its mandate, which was centered on the protection of treaties and treaty rights. In the early years, the Federation focused on improving the day-to-day living conditions First Nations people were facing in the communities. New inroads were made in 1972 with a policy paper that called for Indian control of Indian education. Schools on reserves were transferred to First Nation control, and FSI established its first institutions, including the Saskatchewan Indian Cultural College and the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College. First Nations women began to organize, forming the Saskatchewan Indian Women's Association as an affiliate of the FSI. First Nations' involvement in the negotiations leading up to the repatriation of the Constitution in 1982 proved to be another watershed moment in the history of the Federation. The chiefs agreed to reorganize and restructure. They signed the FSIN Convention and formed Canada's first Indian Legislative Assembly in 1982. The chiefs reorganized as a Federation of Nations, the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations. In the past 35 years as a federation of nations, the chiefs in Saskatchewan through the FSIN have made significant progress in several areas, most notably the creation of the economic and educational institutions that stand unparalleled across the country: the Saskatchewan Indian Gaming Authority, Saskatchewan Indian Cultural Center, Saskatchewan Indian Equity Foundation, First Nations University of Canada, Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies, and Indigenous Gaming Regulators. None of these amazing accomplishments would have been possible without the vision, commitment, perseverance, and leadership of the chiefs of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations over the past 65 years. It is these leaders that we are honoring, celebrating, and taking the time to pay tribute to. John B. Tutusas was born on Poundmaker Cree Nation in 1899. In the 1930s, John worked with the League of Indians of Western Canada, became president in 1934, and worked to establish a single Indian organization within Saskatchewan. He was elected the first chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians in 1959 and served in this capacity until 1961. David Knight was born on Moose Lake Mountain in 1915. In 1959, David was elected as first vice president of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians and was elected chief in 1961. He served in this capacity until August 1964. Chief Knight was the first leader to advocate for on- and off-reserve treaty rights for First Nations people. Wilfred Bellegarde was born on the Little Black Bear Reserve in 1921. In 1949, Wilfred was elected chief of the Little Black Bears Band and moved on to become chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians in 1964. He served in this capacity until 1966. Unity and stability of the Indian nations in Saskatchewan were priorities for Chief Bellegarde. Walter P. Dieter from Pepecasis First Nation was born in 1914 and served as the chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians from 1966 to 1968. He was also the founding president of the National Indian Brotherhood, the predecessor of the Assembly of First Nations. He served as national chief from 1968 to 1970. Chief Dieter was an advocate for the implementation of First Nations self-determination. David Ahenecue was born on the Sandy Lake Reserve in 1933. After a 16-year military career, David came home to Canada as a Korean and peacekeeping veteran. In 1969, he was elected chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians, a position he held until 1978. Chief Ahenecue served as the national chief of the Assembly of First Nations from 1982 to 1985. Albert Bellegarde was born in 1937 as a member of the Little Black Bear First Nation. In 1972, following a teaching career, Albert became the first president of the Saskatchewan Indian Cultural College. In 1978, after holding the position of vice chief responsible for the education portfolio, he was elected chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians until his untimely death in 1979. Saul Sanderson was born in 1941 as a member of the FSIN Band. After 5.5 years with the Prince Albert Police Service, he moved into the area of politics. Saul held the position of vice president prior to serving as chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations from 1979 to 1986. He advocated for the entrenchment of treaties in the Constitution. Roland Crow was born in 1943 as a member of the Piapot First Nation. He began his political career in the 1960s as counselor and chief of the Piapot First Nation. In 1986, Roland was elected chief for the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, a position he held until 1994. As chief, he forged important new protocols and intergovernmental arrangements. Blaine Fable is from the Poundmaker Cree Nation. After serving as chief of his nation, he was elected as chief for the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations from 1994 to 1998. An important work initiated by Chief Fable was the 1996 demographic study, Saskatchewan and Aboriginal Peoples in the 21st Century, Social, Economic, and Political Changes and Challenges. Perry Bellegarde is from the Little Black Bear First Nation. He was elected tribal chair of the Touchwood-File Hills-Qu'Appelle Tribal Council and held that position for 12 years. In 1998, Perry was elected chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations and served as chief until 2003. Chief Bellegarde is a strong advocate for the implementation of First Nations inherent and treaty rights. Alphonse Bird is a member of the Montreal Lake Cree Nation. He served as a band counselor for his nation, as well as vice chief and grand chief of the Prince Albert Grand Council. He was elected chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations in 2003, a position he held until 2006. Chief Bird advocated for improved housing, employment, and community building. Lawrence Joseph was born in 1945 on the Big River First Nation. In 1997, after a career in the military and with the Federal Public Service, he was elected vice chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations until he became chief in 2006. He served as chief until 2009. Chief Joseph advocated for justice and has long provided a voice for the voiceless. Guy Lonechild is a member of the White Bear First Nation. In 2009, after serving 3 terms as vice chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, Guy was elected chief and held this position until 2011. Throughout his political career, he advocated for economic development, health services to families, and renewed relationships with governments to jointly address challenges facing First Nations. Throughout the years, FSIN leaders have upheld the mandate of the FSIN and have been strong advocates for the spirit and intent of treaty, the right to self-determination, self-preservation, and self-sufficiency for First Nations people, all while advocating for peaceful coexistence with all people, sharing this beautiful land. It is with great pride that we celebrate the 65th anniversary of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations.